Hello, this presentation was first given at the third Suffolk Jungian Symposium held at West Suffolk College earlier this year. So this is a almost identical version of the talk to the one given there. And looking at the Jungian interpretation of the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, delving into the ways it can be understood, both as simply as a piece of literature, but also as insights from the author, Oscar Wilde himself, into the realm of the human psyche and how Oscar Wilde's insights interact with the potential Jungian interpretations as well. So it's not just meant to be a reflection on literature, but on the application of psychological theory and concept to life in general. Okay, so some background, for a little bit of background to the book. There was a short version of it published in 1890, so obviously Oscar Wilde had been writing it at some point prior to that. I don't know precisely when he first put pen to paper, but perhaps a year, 18 months before then, given that there is a distinct delay, but as any author will tell you, a distinct delay between the author writing a work and it finally appearing on the bookshelves. The longer novel-length version of The Picture of Dorian Gray appeared in 1891, which ironically is also the year in which he met Lord Alfred Douglas, the man who he fell, some might say, almost madly in love with, in the sort of ancient Greek understanding of love as almost a form of madness, a form of mental illness. His fixation with Alfred Douglas led him ultimately to his own destruction and the end of his public career, the breakdown of his health and all sorts of other problems. So there is a curious sort of prophetic quality to the story of Dorian Gray, in that whilst quite a few people have interpreted Dorian, the character, as emblematic of Lord Alfred Douglas, and there are certainly an awful lot of similarities, when the character of Dorian Gray was created, he hadn't actually met Lord Alfred Douglas. So he's sort of foreshadowing what is about to happen to him and what he's going to, or who rather, he is going to meet in the future, and the passage his life will take in all sorts of rather strange and peculiar ways. The idea for the story itself came about from a time in which Oscar Wilde was sitting as a subject for a portrait of him being painted by the artist Francis Richards in 1887, and sitting there thinking to himself, no doubt, much as the words placed into the character of Dorian himself are, that the picture of him is going to remain young and fresh and vital forevermore, even while the flesh and blood version of him ages and sags and wrinkles and shows all of the wear and tear of the passage of time. Even in a good and healthy life, it still shows wear and tear, let alone a life of excess and debauchery and all sorts of shenanigans, where that wear and tear might show rather more rapidly. And so perhaps Oscar thought to himself as he was sitting there staring off into space, wouldn't it be nice if I stayed young and vital forevermore, and the picture grew old and wrinkled and saggy and haggard? And so that is pretty much what the character of Dorian Gray wishes. And there is in the novel there is a clap of thunder, and some mysterious force makes his wishes come true. It's never actually explained in the story quite what that mysterious force is. Is it God? Is it the devil? Is it some passing genie or a wish-granting fairy or whatever? But something makes his idle, transient wish come to pass. And so the story is born of a man who stays young, well, almost forever, at least till the end of the story, and whose picture grows wrinkled and awful and haggard and shows not only the natural passage of the decades, as it would with anybody, but also the fact that he becomes a particularly wicked, desperate, unpleasant person who does dreadful things to the people around him. And the moral corruption is the real horror, not just a few wrinkles and grey hairs, but moral corruption contained within the picture rather than being reflected in the flesh and the blood. So the photograph here, for anyone unfamiliar, is Lord Alfred Douglas as a young man. Not my idea, I have to say, of beauty, but clearly it appealed to Oscar Wilde. He fell headlong for Alfred Lord Douglas. Maybe the glamour of his physical appearance, maybe his wit, his intelligence, perhaps the blue blood appealed to Oscar in all sorts of slightly snobbish ways, who knows. But thinking slightly less for a minute about Alfred Lord Douglas himself and slightly more about the fictional character of Dorian Gray, we could, from a Jungian point of view, say he is, or at least he becomes, the pure eternus, the eternal youth. Now, for the rest of us in the real world, youth, sadly, is a very transitory experience. It soon passes, and middle age spread, and wrinkles, and age spots, and receding hairlines, and all the rest of it start to take their toll. But in the realm of fiction, Dorian Gray, once this pact, if we can call it that, is made with a supernatural force that has been listening to his requests, once this wish is granted, this pact made, he does not change one iota, physically at least. He doesn't acquire any wrinkles, he doesn't acquire any grey hairs, his waistline never gets so much as a centimetre bigger. He stays like a fly in amber, forevermore this lissom youth. And is this a good thing? Well, in the mind of perhaps Oscar Wilde sitting there in the artist's chair that Richards had directed him to deport himself in, posing for his painting, maybe he thought at the time, wouldn't it be lovely to be young forevermore? And I'm sure many people, judging from the wrinkle cream industry and the plastic surgery industry and all of these various services that are provided to try and make aging flesh look somewhat younger than it actually is. Clearly, many people around the world would spend hefty sums of money in pursuit of maintaining a more youthful appearance than their body is actually naturally capable of maintaining. And so we aspire to this kind of eternal youth. And there's many myths and stories about people who stay young forevermore. In a sense, that's perhaps the root of the modern cinematic vampire. Whilst the vampires of the folk tales and legends throughout Europe and many other parts of the world of several hundred years ago are of diseased, warped, monstrous, awful-looking creatures, much more like Nosferatu in the film of that name, the modern-day kind of early mid-20th century onwards, from pretty much the casting of Bela Lugosi as Dracula, starts to have better-looking vampires, and with each decade that passes, they go for more and more glamorous actors and actresses to play the role of these creatures of the night who, far from being these warped, diseased, hideous things of the folklore of earlier centuries, are catwalk models for the rest of eternity. And it's playing with this idea, what would it be like to have a young body forevermore? So these are not middle-aged vampires, these are not geriatric vampires, these are young, fit and vital vampires. Who wants to have middle-aged spread for the next 1,000 years when you can have youth and vitality and energy and vigour for the next 1,000 years? And it sounds very tempting, but you could argue the entire story is reflecting on this idea that it would come, if it were ever possible to attain that, and I suppose possibly one day science might progress to a level where it's not just a bit of wrinkle cream to slap on every morning, it's some other intervention, some other method that can preserve youthful looks in a far more pronounced manner. Would it come at such a price? And we're not here clearly talking financial price, we're talking other types of prices, that there would be a terrible burden to this. So from a Jungian point of view, every single person, even when you're 70, 80, 90 years old, has an element of their psyche, which is the eternal boy or the eternal girl. This youthful part of us, this memory of childhood, of the person we were as a child, and whom we are capable of becoming again, mentally, not physically, but mentally. When people have nostalgic moments and they see some TV show they loved as a child, or pick up a storybook that carries them back in their memories to when they were 8 years old, when they're under moments of very high stress and they engage in Freudian regression and revert to rather childlike, or indeed, on a more negative context, childish behaviours and sulk and strop and stamp and whatever else. Whether someone was a happy child or a miserable child or an angry child or a playful child, whatever kind of a child they may be, they are capable of returning to that. And there's been plenty of self-help courses run around the world to help people reconnect with their inner child, with the idea, which is rooted in Jungian conceptions, that childlike part of us contains all sorts of benefits. It contains hope, it contains optimism, it contains innocence, it contains creativity. And obviously, as adults, we get burdened down with work and duties to family, to our own kids if we have them, to paying bills and filling in tax returns and doing all of these responsible and let's face it, quite often really boring things that have to be done, that there is often less and less and less joy and innocence and optimism and playfulness in our lives as adults. And so the appeal of these courses that promise to plug us back into that inner child archetype are understandable in the sense that people would like, if you've got a terribly dull, burdensome life, would like a few opportunities to drop those responsibilities for an hour or two or three, and go and sit in the woods and make daisy chains and climb trees and run about and have fun and just, I suppose, not only have fun but also reconnect to a joy in life, and the feeling that the future has good things to offer rather than just yet more tax returns and yet more kissing the boots of some god-awful boss and yet more dreariness. The hope for something joyful rather than something dreary. Obviously, Dorian Gray, his youth is that of a young man rather than that of a small child. And so he is kind of hovering at the edge of where the pure eternus, the eternal boy, becomes the eternal teenager. So somebody's going to be 19 forevermore rather than 9 years old forevermore. So there is that sexualized element that he is a young man with all of the hormonal urges of puberty rushing through his body rather than a little boy who just wants to play with train sets. And that is characteristic of the rest of the story, that he spends an awful lot of time pursuing the pleasures of the flesh rather than climbing trees and playing football or something of that kind. It's a different type of pleasure he is pursuing. So he is kind of on that move out from the eternal child into the eternal lustful young man as an image, as a model. Moving into a bit more Greek myth, a great passion of Oscar Wilde, as well as something that fascinated Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and no end of other people who have studied psychology. Greek myth so often provides models. We have the story of Pygmalion and Galatea. So Pygmalion, the sculptor, creates a statue of a beautiful woman, a statue so perfect, so detailed, and he's spent hours and hours and hours and hours labouring over this statue that by the time he has finished it, he's poured his body and soul and blood and sweat and tears into it, and you can link this into the concept of participation mystique, that when we create something, whether that is as an artist creating a painting, or a sculptor creating a statue, a musician, composer creating a piece of music, or indeed investing yourself in a relationship with a lover, a friend, a relative, whoever, we pour ourselves into it. It becomes a creative act, and part of us goes into the thing we have created. So you could see Dorian Gray kind of as the product of the artist Basil Hallward, the one painting the picture, that Basil becomes Pygmalion, the artist, and Dorian becomes Galatea, the created thing. Or at least his portrait does initially. But once the thunderclap rolls around and the magical spell is cast, it is Dorian himself who becomes the created thing, not the bit of canvas hanging in the attic. So he becomes this product of creativity. And again, thinking in archetypal terms, the persona is the created part of us. It's the face we put to the world, the portrait we hang in the front window of the shop for other people to look at and think, oh, this is such and such a type of person. It is worth mentioning from a Jungian point of view, it is not a fake. It's not that the person is pretending and lying through their back teeth to create an image of something they're not. It's rather they are very consciously selecting certain elements of their own psyche and making a deliberate effort to hide other bits of their psyche to show a facet of a diamond, one facet of a diamond to the world, and not invite the world to be aware that the diamond has other facets which are less obvious. So we maintain this public front to the world, and that's kind of what Dorian is moving into, someone who is a facet of himself that's shown to the world, and he no longer has the capacity to go beyond that, to move beyond that, to grow into other things, to adapt and to change and to explore. He is, again, the fly in amber that cannot age, that cannot change, that cannot be more than it is. I think there's a reasonable argument to make here that this is also, from Wilde's point of view, a study in narcissism. Dorian is an intensely self-absorbed, narcissistic character. We've had people like Jean Piaget arguing that every child, when they're very small, is quite narcissistic, in as much as they only really understand the world from their own point of view, their own likes and dislikes and hopes and fears and so on and so forth. They don't quite understand that other people think differently, feel differently, like different things, dislike different things. It's a skill which is usually referred to in psychological circles as theory of mind, that develops the understanding that the contents of other people's heads are different from the contents of our own heads. And so we can project and transpose ourselves and understand the world through other people's viewpoints and other people's understandings. They know things I don't know. They like things I don't like. They dislike things I don't dislike. And it's kind of put ourselves in other people's perspectives. Or at least we used to be able to do that until the internet took over. I'm not quite sure we are as good at doing that anymore. Creation of echo chambers severely undermines people's capacity to empathize and understand the world from any point of view except their own, that they just kind of rattle around and hear the same opinions, the same outlooks again and again and again, and the algorithms support them in just reflecting the sound of their own voice back to them constantly, which I suspect, although I can't prove it, I don't have any concrete research on the topic, but I suspect actively pushes a great deal of narcissism in the modern world. But obviously that's not what Oscar Wilde is talking about here. He's talking about self-absorption in the more usual sense of an adult who ought to be able to understand other people, ought to be able to think from their perspective, understand their capacity for hope and fear and hurt and joy and so on, but makes a conscious choice to stick their own head up their own nether regions and just obsess over themselves and me, rather than ever having to think about anybody else. And that's pretty much how Dorian goes on to live the rest of his life, falling in love with his own reflection, like Narcissus in the Greek myth. Worth noting, I think, that in the Greek story, and obviously Oscar was perfectly familiar with this, he was a great, huge student of Greek myth, wrote a great deal of poetry about it and all sorts of other works as well that draw upon Greek myth. Narcissus is an astoundingly good-looking young man who wins the hearts of every woman and a great many other men who see him pass by. Lots of people fall in love with him, but he's so up himself, he couldn't give a damn about anybody else. He uses them and casts them aside and goes on to the next and the next and the next and the next, with absolutely no care, no regard for anything other than his own immediate pleasure. And as soon as he's bored with somebody, he dumps them, goes on to the next. The poor old nymph Echo fades away into nothingness for unrequited love of Narcissus. Amenius hangs himself in grief because Narcissus has had a relationship with him, used him, got bored with him, dumped him, and gone on to the next, totally oblivious to the fact that Amenius is madly in love with him. Couldn't give a damn how hurt, how grief-stricken the young man is. And the goddess Nemesis, bringer of a form of justice, of vengeance, of righteous wrathfulness, sees this suicide, sees the fading of Echo into nothingness, and curses Narcissus to fall deeply, madly in love with the next person he sees. And as fate, or indeed Nemesis herself, would have it, the very next person he sees is his own reflection in the water when he leans over to get a drink of water. And he falls madly in love with himself, which arguably he is anyway. He's already madly in love with himself. But the madness takes a step further, which of course is the curse of Nemesis, in that he leans so far over the bank in order to give his reflection a big kiss that he falls arse over tit into the river and he can't swim, so he drowns. And that's the end of him, except his essence is sort of plucked out by the gods and transformed into the flower, referred to as a narcissus in some parts of the world and as a daffodil over here, and sits on the banks of rivers and pools, nodding and gazing at itself in the reflective surface of the lake. So the story is one of the dangers of arrogance, the dangers of self-obsession, the dangers of callow beauty that cares nothing for anyone but itself. Both the dangers posed to other people who are unfortunate enough to get swept up in the wake of the stunningly beautiful, used and abused and cast aside by them, and the dangers to the beautiful person themselves, that their self-obsession will ultimately lead to their own destruction, tearing themselves apart, drowning themselves in the depths of their own unconscious mind, losing any kind of meaning or reality, losing any quality of life because they live constantly on the surface, gazing into a mirror, adoring their own reflections, and these days I suppose gazing into a phone at their self is oblivious to what they could have in life if they were capable or willing to become capable of empathy, of theory of mind, of caring about somebody other than themselves. If they could make an emotional connection with somebody else rather than just shag and go, then the depth of quality of romances, of friendships, of other types of relationships that they could have with the people around them, they could develop depth of character, and so not only be good looking, but be decent people, admirable people, developed people, what Jung would call individuated people. They could have all that instead of just being a self-obsessed dimwit, which is what they're opting for. So it's a multi-level danger to self, but also danger to the other people who get harmed on the way, which is something I sometimes feel within Jungian psychology we kind of a little bit overlook, because Jungian psychology is so much about individuation. We often forget the damage that can be caused to other people by the cruel, the selfish, the greedy, the vain, those who succumb to unpleasant characteristics. As well as having an obsession with ancient Greece and other parts of the ancient world, Oscar Wilde was also deeply entranced by Catholicism, although he never fully converted. Having been brought up as a fairly hardline Protestant in Ireland, he kind of always stayed just that side of the fence, although he would have liked to convert it. And ironically, Alfred Lord Douglas, some years after the death of Oscar Wilde, did convert to Catholicism. But that's another story. Within Catholicism, you have the 7 deadly sins, one of which in Latin is superbia, or more usually translated into English as pride, or sometimes translated as vanity, self-obsession, worshipping yourself as more important than worshipping God. So, and that's the kind of the bedrock of each of the 7 deadly sins, is that something, money, food, anger, whatever, is more important to you than serving God. And so the sin puts a barrier between you and God. And for the sin of superbia, self-obsession, self-admiration, self-absorption is the barrier. The thing that is worshipped as more important than God is me. I. The self, the face in the mirror, or, as per the story, the face in the picture, in the portrait. Oscar Wilde didn't kind of go into massive amounts of literary criticism about his own work. Very sensibly, he left that kind of obsessiveness to other people, but he did occasionally chuck a nugget out about the kind of creative process of producing his own works, including this little one here, where he talks about 3 of the characters in the picture. Basil Hallward, the artist, is what I think I am. Lord Henry is what the world thinks of me. Dorian is what I would like to be. So he'd like to be this beautiful, rather superficial character, swanning through the world, seducing beautiful young men, and well, possibly he wouldn't have been that bothered about beautiful young women, but the character in the book is just as willing to seduce women as to seduce men, and having this kind of way old time of licentiousness. Basil Hallward, the troubled artist, is what he feels himself to really be like. We'll get on to Lord Henry momentarily, the aristocrat who corrupts Dorian in the first place. It's a film still from one of the many cinematic versions of Dorian Gray. So Basil Hallward is not the most developed of characters. He's the artist, the one who creates this picture, and obviously has painted many other pictures over his career. The creator, the one who commits the act of creation. And from a psychological point of view, a Jungian point of view, there is a bit of us, this generative power that creates. Some people may create machinery, technology. Some people may create painting, some may create music, some may create sculpture, some might create tapestries and textiles, some might create cakes and superb meals. It doesn't matter what you create, there is always the creative urge there, and it needs to be vented. I say always, that's obviously clearly an assumption on my part, because I've not spoken to the entirety of humanity, clearly, to know that absolutely everybody has a creative urge. It's an assumption. Maybe there are some people in the world who don't, but let's go for the argument that most of us at least have a creative urge. And to some extent, the prime thing that is created for everyone, alongside paintings and novels and music and all the rest of it, is ourselves a kind of a self-creating process, that at the start of our lives we are a little bit like a lump of clay just sitting there. That lump of clay can be moulded and shaped into all sorts of ways. And obviously, the environment, the people around us, mum, dad, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, teachers, the vicar, the people on television, all the rest of it, exert some degree of moulding process in terms of shaping us in certain ways and making us more like this thing and less like that thing. But Jung would argue, I strongly suspect, that the majority of the creation is self-creation. And even where we are being subject to strong influences by environmental factors and the people around us, we still have a capacity to rebel, to resist, to go in different directions, to say, no, I don't want to be the thing that you're trying to make me. I want to be this other thing instead. Now, something that Jung largely sidesteps is the issue of genetics. And I think that, in fairness, the vast majority of Jungian writers and analysts tend to sidestep genetics to a large extent. So James Hillman, when he's talking about the soul code, does talk in the context of, is this genetic? Is it spiritual? Is it something else? But he, like a lot of Jungians, he sort of avoids coming down one side of an argument or another, and largely leaves it to the reader to make up their own mind. So is there a genetic code that predisposes me to be one thing rather than another? A kind of an unfolding blueprint, and certainly James Hillman uses this analogy of an acorn, that the acorn will always grow into an oak tree. It can never grow into a holly bush. It can never grow into a hazel tree. It can never grow into a birch tree. It will always grow into an oak tree. But whether it's a big oak tree or a little oak tree or a medium-sized oak tree, all of that depends on environmental nourishment and circumstances and the consequences of personal choices that the individual makes and so on. So you could be the biggest oak tree you are capable of being, or you could be a warped, stunted little oak tree. Each of us could be the best version of ourselves or the absolutely worst version of ourselves, or somewhere in the middle. And I assume that probably the majority of people are somewhere in the middle. Kind of people tend to fall to the average, arrive at the mean. So you could see the creator side as a kind of a driving genetic blueprint. If you come from a much more religious background, you might see a kind of a divine thumbprint there, that a god or a set of gods have placed some kind of pattern on each of us and said, you will become so-and-so type of person, and either we can kind of move in the direction that the divine wants us to go in, or we can kick and scream and struggle and try and become something else and probably make a complete mess of our lives in the process of going against the divine grain. Or some people might go down the reincarnation line and suggest that the soul, over the process of multiple reincarnations, is pushing in certain directions, making certain choices for each incarnation, and then that's present in the unconsciousness and it unfolds over the course of the lifetime. However you want to understand it, I'll do the typical vague nonsense and leave it to you, the listener, to decide for yourself quite what you think is the driving force. But a person unfolds. Some of you may think there's no driving force. We're a total tabula rasa, blank slate, and we can become any damn thing we want to be, which is fine if you want to believe that. But whether you think we're a blank canvas or whether you think we're more like a block of marble with certain fracture patterns going in different directions, which make certain outcomes more likely than other outcomes once the blow of hammer and chisel is struck, we'll leave that to you. From a Freudian, and obviously Jung being a student of Freud did integrate and retain certain elements of Freudian theory. Basil is the more moral character in the story. He wants the best for Dorian. He's fallen in love with Dorian. There's no real suggestion that there's anything sexual going on between him and Dorian. More of an unrequited wistfulness on the part of the artist, that he's just very taken with this handsome, charming young man. He's painted various pictures of him already. It's already stated that he's got Dorian to dress up in various historical outfits and posed for other pictures. But this particular picture, the one he is painting at the crucial point in the story, this is his best version, his most perfect version, and it's Dorian as he is then, as he is in real life, rather than Dorian dressed up in ancient Roman, ancient Greek, ancient whatever type of costumes for all of these period pieces. So it kind of takes on this super ego role. He is the moral conscience that is trying to push Dorian in the right direction and seeing the best in Dorian, wanting the best for Dorian, admiring him for his beauty and charm, and kind of wanting to help and support that. In Irish myth, and for those unfamiliar, Oscar Wilde was Irish. Both his mother and his father were experts on Irish folklore and mythology and wrote books and papers about it. And it is very, very odd. So I mentioned it in other recordings and live lectures and so on, that Oscar writes extensively and draws on imagery from Greek myth, from Roman myth, from Egyptian myth. He never, in any of his works I've ever come across, never makes any mention of Irish myth. But he would have been told extensively by his mother and father about it. Now, is this a conscious choice on his part? A kind of a teenage rebellion? He just got a bit bored with mum and dad going on about it and thought, oh, sod that, I'll go and do something else. Or is it a kind of a social class aspiration? He wanted to be taken seriously by the literati of Victorian society, and he knew that they were very snobbish about Irish folklore, and so he went in favour of the thing, classical mythology, that they, with their boarding school educations, would favour most strongly. I don't know. He'd probably have been told by either his mother or his father, or indeed both of them, about the Líon She, an Irish myth about this kind of muse, this spirit that comes along and finds artists and musicians and poets and other creative types and attaches itself to them, the fairy mistress. Once she's attached herself to somebody, she fills them with vision, incredibly intense creative visions, and the artist goes on a splurge. And for several days, they don't eat, they don't sleep, they don't drink, they just churn out paintings or statues or compositions or whatever style of art they create. And by the end of it, as the Líon She, the vampire, is feeding off them in this creative frenzy, by the end of it, they die of exhaustion, burnt out, consumed by their own creativity. They have created their best works, their most memorable works, but at the cost of their own life. They're gone, they're dead, they're spent. And the vampire moves on to find a fresh victim. Certainly there are a fair number of artistic people who do have creative frenzies, who will go for prolonged periods without taking care of themselves, not eating properly, not sleeping properly, just painting or writing or doing whatever style of art they have. And sometimes their mental health and their physical health does indeed suffer. I mean, it's quite rare for them to actually die, but other forms of suffering do kick in. And Basil is ultimately destroyed by his own creation. Further on in the story, spoilers, Dorian murders him. The thing, the person, the muse he has loved, he has adored, he has doted on, murders him. And it's a horrible element in the story, intentionally, deliberately horrible. It reminds me a little bit, tiny little bit, of people like Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes. And later on, Agatha Christie creating Hercule Poirot. People who, highly creative people, who produce a work or a character within the work that burns through them, consumes them, takes up so much of their energy at their time that creator eventually comes to resent their own creation. Arthur Conan Doyle got so sick of Sherlock Holmes he killed him off. Public demand was so intense and the pressure from the publishers so intense that eventually he had to bring him back from the dead. Agatha Christie got equally sick to death of Hercule Poirot and was kind of pressurized into putting him into books that she didn't really want to put him into, where she wanted to do some other detective, but the publisher said, "Oh, no, we've got to have another Poirot." It's not uncommon for artists to be burnt out, not to the point of fatality, but to be burnt up by their own creative muses, things that inspired them in the first place, got them going, got them writing, painting, doing whatever else, but eventually become burdensome to them. And there's an interesting kind of risk, I suppose, which Jung himself doesn't really talk about, but within participation mystique, what happens if the thing you have poured your heart and soul and blood and sweat and tears into starts to demand more and more and more and becomes less of a muse and more of a vampire, draining you, burning you out, consuming you up, so that there's no room for any other kind of creativity. An actor who is only ever known for one role that so overshadows every other part they've played that they can kind of end up resenting the role. That, yes, maybe it's brought them fame and wealth, but that they feel so overshadowed by it that it becomes a burden as much as a blessing. So I mentioned Lord Henry Wotton. In the story, he is this terribly wealthy aristocrat who is very much, as per that Oscar Wilde quote, the sort of public image of Oscar Wilde, witty and charming and decadent and suave and a little bit dark, a little bit sinister in the eyes of other people. He says all of the most shocking, outrageous, outre things that have maiden aunts swooning and loosening their corsets. And perhaps leads people, very Christian, leads them into temptation. In the story itself, Henry Wotton doesn't really do anything. He's a windbag. He talks and he talks and he talks, but he doesn't actually put any of his grand ideas and naughty, saucy aspirations into practice. It's Dorian that goes to all of the opium dens and shags his way around half of London and does all sorts of sordid, grotty things that are hinted at, but because of the publishing standards of the day, are never gone into in explicit detail. Wotton says how much he'd like to be doing all of those things and how fabulous he thinks it would be to do them, and how the truly liberated Nietzschean man should be off doing all of these things, but he doesn't do them. It's all piss and wind with him. All mouth, no trousers, basically. And that's an interesting element in itself. It'd be easy from a Jungian point of view to see Wotton as the shadow, the dark side of the characters. He is the force that corrupts Dorian from this rather innocent lad from a somewhat provincial background when he first arrives in London, whose head is filled up with all of these amoral, at best, if not outright immoral, notions of what he should be doing with his life and how he should be pleasuring himself and indulging himself and not give a damn about the cost to anybody else. All these things that Wotton is egging him on to do, he actually goes and does. So he slips deeper and deeper, a little by little, and it is a slippage rather than a plunge. So one little thing leads to a slightly more racy little thing, and another one and another. And before you know it, or before he knows it, he is driving people to suicide. He's doing the most awful things to people. He's just turned into a pretty vile, unpleasant character. From a Christian point of view, the devil is the tempter. Get thee behind me, Satan. It's not that he goes around murdering and torturing and raping and robbing banks and standing for Parliament and doing other shocking, disgusting things. Rather, he gets other people, mere mortals, to do it. He is the one standing behind them, whispering in their ear, "Oh, why don't you steal that thing? Why don't you punch that person in the face? Why don't you take advantage of that drunk and use them for your pleasures? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why? Ultimately, it's down to the individual to choose to do it. So the devil never actually puts a gun to anyone's head, never arm twists them and forces them to do a thing. He just whispers the idea, stands back, and waits to see if that person will act on the suggestion or whether they will exhibit a bit of moral backbone and go, "Oh no, I'm not doing that naughty thing," and resist. And of course, in the story, young Mr. Gray does not resist. He indulges and indulges and indulges. We can also link Henry Wotton to the idea of the senex, the wise sage. And every archetype has both a light side and a dark side from a Jungian perspective. So the wise sage is the older, wiser bit of us, the one that can see ahead and understands the world. In no end of myths and legends and stories and films and so forth, the younger character, the young lad or young girl who starts at the story, has a mentor, some wiser older figure, whether that is Dumbledore or Obi-Wan Kenobi or the fairy godmother or somebody or another who hovers there, who has wisdom and knowledge and experience and is trying as a moral conscience, again a bit of a superego type figure, to steer the innocent in the right direction. That's the bright side. The dark side is the Voldemort, the Saruman, the corrupter, the wicked fairy who curses Sleeping Beauty, the one that's got the knowledge and the experience and the understanding, but uses it to destructive ends. And obviously that's what Henry Wotton is. He's got the knowledge, but he destroys rather than creates. He corrupts rather than inspires. He has no moral restraint upon him. So all those Aristotelian virtues that Oscar Wilde would have been familiar with from his readings as a young man especially, about treading the golden mean and the middle path, not too much, not too little, just right, all very Goldilocks. Henry Wotton is, well, not doing, but saying, chuck that all to the wind, go for every excess, indulge every depravity, every vice, do whatever you want to whoever you want, let there be no restrictions, no restraints, none of this moral nonsense. It's a kind of very Nietzschean aspiration to be beyond conventional morality, with this contemptuous notion that conventional morality is just staid and dull and boring, and it's for weaklings and old fools who don't have the guts and the courage to go out and seize life by both hands and take every pleasure. But it also ignores the other half of the moral adjunct of take what you want, but pay for it. A lot of people like listening to the first bit, take what you want. They don't like listening to the second bit, pay for it. And in Henry Wotton's case, it is Dorian who pays for it, not him. Sybil Vane is the short-lived romantic interest in the story, a young actress who plays a lot of Shakespearean parts, the sort of ingenue parts. And at the start of her appearance in the story, for her, these plays and Shakespeare's poetry and all the rest of it is romance, it's love, and she knows nothing of love through lived experience, only through reading about it in romantic plays and stories and poems and such like. So she's kind of living life at a second-hand remove. And then she meets Dorian, and she falls madly head over heels in love with him. He is the great passion of her life, and she realizes the difference between theatrical romance, sort of all these poems and plays and lovely speeches and what have you, the kind of intellectual understanding of what it's all about, to the first-hand lived, direct, raw emotional experience. So if we want to think in terms of Jungian personality types, she begins more as the thinking type, the abstract type, and then she ends as the feeling type, the one that's got it full throttle, and it's no longer just pretty words in a play. She now lives it. And the lived reality is quite different from the pretty words in the play. And like Echo, like Aminius, like all of the other people destroyed in the wake of Narcissus, she ends up destroyed because once Dorian's had his way with her, he eventually, as he does with everybody else, gets bored, and she's just this clingy girlfriend that he could do without, sobbing and wailing in the corner and being an embarrassment. So he dumps her very unceremoniously, very brutally. And she's so distraught, so broken, she goes and slings herself in a river, in the Thames. Very Ophelia, chucking herself into water and dying that way. That quote there is from Dorian himself, where he's being sort of upbraided about the death of Sybil Vane. Oh, the girl never really lived, and so she never really died. Shrugging his shoulders, who gives a damn? She's there, she's gone. From a Jungian point of view, we could argue that Sybil is the anima. She is the feminine side of Dorian. And maybe a significant part of Dorian's problem, now that he's frozen in amber and can't grow and can't move, is that he cannot, or will not, depending on how you want to view it, come to terms with his anima. So somebody who is not frozen in amber, who can move and grow and mature and develop, according to Jung, you spend the first 40 years of your life living and experiencing, and the next 40 years of your life reflecting and maturing and developing. And you come to terms, a man comes to terms with his anima, a woman comes to terms with her animus. But Dorian can't change. He's fixed. He is a fixed point in time. And so he is perhaps incapable of coming to terms with his anima. So he rips it to shreds. He rips that capacity for compassion, for empathy, for feeling, for tenderness, for mercy, because he shows none of those qualities and he will never develop those qualities. And that's what, at least partially, drags him down into vacuity. That he looks pretty, he is quite entertaining company when he's being witty and charming, but he has no more depth to him than the canvas in the attic has. He's paper thin, or canvas thin if you prefer. And he will never be anything else. A lot of people are fairly superficial, particularly when they're young, but they have the capacity to develop depth as they get older and gain more experience of life and more understanding and more compassion, more kindness, more gentleness, smooth off their rough edges. But he never does. He never will. That's his problem. Another film still here. So we've already mentioned the idea of participation mystique, that the created work, whether it's a painting or a statue or a novel or a poem or a piece of music or whatever it might be, is something that the creator, the artist, pours themselves into. And so they never fully die. And there is an element in which participation mystique can be seen as a kind of aspiration to immortality, or at least extended life, if not absolute immortality. That, obviously, Oscar Wilde has been dead and buried many, many, many decades now, but we're still talking about him, we're still reading his books, reading his poetry, watching his plays. His name lives on through his art. And the same may be said of people who've been dead 500 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years or longer than that, whose creative works still live on, including the works of people whose names are unknown. Statues and pyramids and temples where we don't know the names of the people who carved them and built them and shaped them, they are forgotten as such. So a bit debatable whether they have immortality in that sense if their names are lost. But their impact upon the world continues. And if we think in terms of participation mystique, pouring ourselves into a relationship, as well as the more conventional forms of art, that relationship can be understood as a kind of an art from a participation mystique point of view, the friendships, the romances, the parental relationships, the sibling relationships, and all the rest of it that shape our lives. When we are dead and buried, our children, if we've had them, will live on after us, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc. But friends will continue to live on, maybe lovers, husbands, wives, whatever, continue to live on, and hopefully carry positive memories of us. I mean, obviously, some people, the memories are going to be extremely negative, but hopefully the memories are positive. And so that itself is a kind of extension of life through participation mystique, whilst you are remembered, especially if you're remembered in a positive light. I suppose technically people still remember Stalin and Pol Pot and so on, but not in a good way. Jung was thinking of being remembered in a good way rather than in a negative way. There are myths and legends. It mentions there Koshai the Deathless, a major character in Russian mythology, and the fictional characters very similar to him in some respect, like Voldemort. People who split their soul to at least 2, if not 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces, so that they will never fully die because there's always a bit of them somewhere. Certainly in mythology, that's not seen as a good thing or a healthy thing to do. Seen as quite a monstrous thing to do, to kind of remove the soul from the body, so that if the body dies or is damaged or whatever, there is that spark of life somewhere else continuing on. But again, you could see it in a more positive light, that even when the musician, the sculptor, the artist, the novelist dies, there is an essence of them in their music, in their statues, in their novels, a kind of a spark of them, a little bit of soul of them that continues on after they've gone. Perhaps the problem with Dorian is that he doesn't want the painting to continue on after he's gone, because he doesn't want to go. He wants to cling on to life forever and ever and ever, rather than allow his soul to be spread in a positive way between paintings, music, art, happy, joyful relationships, and all of the other more conventional things that most people leave a bit of themselves behind in. He doesn't want to let it go. He wants to have the eternal youth. And of course, youth, the pure, the child, is a metaphor for life. Whereas age, the senex, the wrinkled, paunchy, balding bit, is the reminder of approaching death and approaching decay. He doesn't want that. He wants eternal youth, eternal life, eternal vitality. And that is, again, part of his problem. The photo there is Alfred Lord Douglas in his dotage. I could make some very unkind comments about the portrait in the attic, but I'll let the picture speak for itself. He may have lived way longer than Oscar Wilde lived, but I don't know that it did him any good. Certainly became a very morally dodgy character, obsessed with anti-Semitism, became quite supportive towards the Nazis at one point, all sorts of very dodgy shenanigans he became involved with. Anyway, putting his life aside, the fictional character of Dorian goes from being the pure, the youth, the innocent, the hopeful, the vital, to becoming a rake, the decadent, and the rake you could think of as a sort of dark side of the Puritanus. This sort of person clinging on to their youth and the excesses of their youth way past the point when they ought to have calmed down a bit and matured and become more compassionate and more sensible and kinder. So I dare say some of the people listening to this might think of individuals you've known personally, or at least heard of, read about, who even when they were 40, 50, 60, 70, who knows what age, were still trying to live the rock and roll lifestyle of their youth and engage in all of the sex and drugs and rock and roll and partying and whatnot of when they were younger. No matter the toll it took on their body, no matter the toll it took on the quality of their relationships, on the people around them, that constant pursuit of pleasure and excess rather than embracing other aspects that come with maturity that might have made them better. And possibly part of that, at least for men, is the fear of the anima. That maybe if they come to terms with the anima, with the feminine within them, and of course the actual flesh and blood women in their lives, then they might mature, they might develop, they might stabilize, they might move from constant pleasure to physical pleasures to emotional commitment and engagement and love and compassion and kindness. For women, I'm not wholly sure what the female version of this would be, of a woman who's constantly clinging on to her youth and has fear of the animus. What the female term for a rake would be. But obviously there's plenty of women of advancing decades who are cosmetically, through makeup and surgery and injections and who knows what else, clinging on to this desire to look about 30 years younger than they actually are. And not just look, but live as if they were 30 years younger than they are. Not wanting to mature, not wanting to grow up. Something like Ab Fab as a comedy, absolutely fabulous, is perhaps a really good example of that with the, well, I was going to say at least two characters. There's quite a few characters in that who are constantly clinging on to their youth, trying to live the wild party life, never forming warm relationships, never forming loving relationships, just a constant pursuit of selfish indulgence, no matter the scarring that's caused to the friends around them, to the children around them, to the endless broken relationships around them. So there's kind of a woman's equivalent of the rake and what can happen there. Now, there is perhaps an argument within the story of the Picture of Dorian Gray that even a shattered soul, one split, and in this case it's split not into 7 Horcruxes like Voldemort, but split into 2, a bit in Dorian himself and a bit in his picture in the attic, that eventually that which is split must reunite. And so eventually Dorian, in a rage, is exploding all over the place, trying to hurt people, do all sorts of horrible things, and eventually destroys the picture in the attic. And the destruction of the actual canvas leads to the release of the soul trapped within the canvas. And it reunites, and what is on the canvas becomes part of what is on the flesh. So the beautiful, eternally youthful body is united with the image of age and corruption and decadence and spite and cruelty and nastiness that has been encapsulated in this hideous painting that gets worse and worse and worse, with every horrible thing that the real flesh and blood Dorian has been out doing over the many, many decades of his life, way more decades than he ought to have lived. And the flesh reflects the canvas, becomes one, and he keels over dead. He dies. So that the shattered becomes whole again, but not necessarily in a wonderful way. Sometimes the becoming whole is the visitation of the consequences of every excess that has been engaged in, every nastiness that has been engaged in. A kind of, what should we call it, a karmic accounting, where everything that has been done of an awful nature, rather than of a good nature, comes to bear on a person who seems, up till that point in time, to have gotten away with everything. There is a quote, I'll have to paraphrase because my memory is not fantastic, from Oscar Wilde himself, where in one of his plays, one of his characters says, "The good were rewarded, the wicked punished. This is how we know that it was fiction." Which is terribly cynical, but it's a cynicism I can share. Over the decades, I can think of quite a few people that I've known personally, and quite a few sort of famous people that I've never known personally, but I kind of watch what happens in the news, who've done really horrible, nasty, spiteful, unpleasant things, and appear, to an outside observer at least, to have gotten away with it. There's been no comeuppance. No one holds them accountable. Maybe because they're glib, because they're charming, because maybe they've got money to kind of oil their way out of situations. Maybe they've got power and people like sucking up to power. But they go year after year after year after year, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. And you kind of, as an observer, you kind of want something horrible to happen to them as a punishment, as a comeuppance. And you think, well, it's about time you got yours for all of the nastiness you've done to other people. But some of them get to old age, some of them indeed get to their deathbeds without any accountability. I mean, you could think of just an example of one celebrity who died without ever being held accountable, like Jimmy Savile. A horrific list as long as several arms of god-awful things that he did to other people. And he dies peacefully in bed, a very rich man with, at the moment of his death at least, his reputation pretty much intact. Obviously, now he's dead and buried. We all know what he was getting up to, so his reputation is now shredded, but he's not around to care. At least he's not around in this world to care. I mean, maybe he's in some afterlife getting a pitchfork shoved up his nether regions, but who knows? There is a natural wish for justice, I think, for a lot of people, that whether you are the one on the receiving end of injustice or it's somebody you care about who's been ill-treated and abused, and the person who's done it seems to have gotten away with it scot-free and has just waltzed off and is continuing to live their best life without any accountability for the crappy thing they've done. We want to see something happen. It's arguably the reason why detective fiction is so popular, because at the end of every Agatha Christie, almost, the baddie gets their comeuppance. They're caught, they're exposed, and the police turn up and cart them off to prison or the hangman's noose or whatever it may be. So the wicked are punished. And usually in Agatha Christie, the good are rewarded, because there's always a bit of love and romance going on there for the sweet young things. But we want to see some sort of justice. And so often in real life, we don't. Hence Oscar Wilde's quotation that that's how we know it's fiction, because so often in reality, the corrupt and the wicked and the terrible get to their deathbeds without any accountability. And the poor benighted victims get used and abused and trampled on and broken, and they never get any kind of recompense, compensation, healing. They're just cast onto the rubbish heap and forgotten about. And so, because this is a work of fiction, perhaps, there is justice for Sybil Vane and all of the other victims of Dorian over the decades, that he gets his comeuppance. The wickedness is visited upon him. He dies horribly. He doesn't individuate. The potential there, I suppose, is that he might have been redeemed at some point, but that is denied him. That's gone. The Instrument of the Destruction, for anyone who either hasn't read it or seen the film versions, or if you have, it was so long ago you've forgotten the details. The knife he uses to murder Basil Hallward is also the knife he uses when he is wigging out in the attic, and it's the knife that gets plunged into the canvas. So there is a kind of a bit of a poetic justice that the murder weapon becomes the kind of unintended suicide weapon, in a sense, the weapon of his own self-destruction. We could get very symbolist here and draw a little bit again on Jungian imagery of symbols and dreams and the unconscious, that a blade is so often a symbol of the intellect, of the capacity of the thinking type to dissect life and cut things apart in a very neat, clean fashion. And so we can kind of see an element here in which perhaps it's the intellect that has allowed him to cut off his emotions, his anima, go around doing all these awful things to people for whom he feels no kindness, no friendship, no compassion, no warmth. But it's also that intellect that will eventually turn on him and be the cause of his own destruction, the cause of his own annihilation. Okay, that's brought it to an end. Now, obviously, the any questions bit was there for the benefit of the live audience when this was being given as a talk at the Jungian Symposium. If anyone has any thoughts, reflections, ideas, questions, by all means, type them in the comments section, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it and respond to your thoughts and views. And the applications of these ideas, either if you're into literary analysis or you're a counsellor, a therapist, a mental health worker of some sort, the ways in which the insights both from Carl Jung and from Oscar Wilde can be used to hopefully help people who might be turning into the kind of narcissistic monster that Dorian Gray turned into, or maybe they're more of a Sybil Vane and they're being victimized by someone who is a narcissist, or perhaps they align more with one of the other characters like Basil maybe, and you're trying to help somebody in one of those situations. But we'll leave it there for now, and I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.